Thank you for joining us right now. You are welcome to Criminal Scene TV. Let's take a look at what is happening right now.
So this is my window that I'm getting ready in the morning, and I saw him out there. So I couldn't make out his face. Well, he was in kind of street clothes, not shoes that you'd walk in, and he had a baseball hat really low, and he was kind of hunched over, and he was kind of looking around, and he just didn't fit. And he wasn't going terribly quickly like a normal person that's getting exercise. He was kind of going slowly, and when he walked by this street, he really took a long look at it.
For weeks, the disappearance of 84-year-old Nancy Guthrie has been surrounded by a strange and unsettling silence. No arrests, no public suspects, no clear explanation from investigators about what happened inside her Tucson home the night she vanished. Yet behind that silence lies an enormous volume of evidence. Investigators are believed to be analyzing thousands of hours of security footage, digital records, and movement data tied to the final hours before Nancy Guthrie disappeared. Every nearby camera, every vehicle that passed through the neighborhood, every electronic signal leaving the area has reportedly been examined. But one detail sits at the center of the mystery. In the early hours of the morning, Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker monitor suddenly stopped transmitting. Only minutes later, a small vehicle was captured on a nearby residential camera moving through the same quiet street. The timing is so precise that investigators believe it may not be coincidence. And as detectives worked backward through that narrow window of time, two names began appearing repeatedly in the timeline. One was the last person known to see Nancy alive. The other was a man tied to him by nearly 2 decades of friendship. Individually, each piece of information seems ordinary. But when the timeline is assembled minute by minute, investigators believe those ordinary details may reveal something far more significant. Every complex investigation eventually narrows down to a single moment in time, a point where ordinary events suddenly stop making sense. In the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, investigators believe that moment may exist inside a window of just a few minutes. It begins with a signal. Nancy Guthrie, at 84 years old, relied on a pacemaker that transmitted routine monitoring data through a bedside device in her home. These monitors are designed to send periodic signals to medical networks, confirming that the device remains active and functioning. When those signals stop unexpectedly, it immediately raises questions. In the early hours of the morning, that signal stopped. The monitor that had been quietly transmitting data from Nancy Guthrie's bedroom suddenly went silent. To investigators, this wasn't simply a technical detail. It marked the last confirmed electronic trace of activity connected to her inside the home. But what makes this moment so important is what appears to happen next. Just minutes after the pacemaker monitor stopped transmitting, a residential security camera located on a nearby property recorded a vehicle moving slowly along the street. The footage shows a compact car passing through the quiet neighborhood during a time when almost no traffic would normally be expected. At first glance, the clip appears ordinary. A car drives by, the street remains quiet, nothing dramatic occurs on camera. But investigators began focusing on one simple question: why was that car there at that exact moment? The timing between the pacemaker signal loss and the appearance of the vehicle reportedly falls within an extremely narrow range, roughly 6 minutes. In investigative terms, that gap is small enough to suggest the possibility that the two events are connected. If someone entered the home, moved Nancy Guthrie, and then left the neighborhood, that 6-minute window may represent the transition between two phases of activity. Inside the house, something interrupts the normal electronic monitoring of Nancy's medical device. Outside the house, a vehicle begins moving away from the area. This type of timeline reconstruction is one of the first methods investigators use when trying to understand a disappearance. Each digital timestamp becomes a marker, a point on a larger map of events that detectives slowly assemble piece by piece. But timelines are rarely perfect. Security cameras may be slightly out of sync. Devices can record events with small delays. Investigators often allow for a margin of error when comparing digital records from different systems. Even with those margins accounted for, the sequence still draws attention. A monitor stops transmitting. Minutes later, a car appears. And somewhere between those two events lies a question that investigators have been trying to answer ever since. What happened inside Nancy Guthrie's home during those missing minutes? Because if that short window truly marks the moment when events began to unfold, then the key to understanding the entire disappearance may lie within those 6 minutes. A brief stretch of time that investigators believe could explain how an elderly woman vanished without a trace from a quiet neighborhood in the middle of the night. When investigators analyze surveillance footage, they rarely begin by looking for something dramatic. In fact, the most important clue is often the one designed not to stand out at all. The vehicle captured on the residential security camera in the minutes following the pacemaker signal loss did not roar down the street. It did not speed away or behave erratically. It simply passed through the neighborhood like any other car might during a quiet night. And that is precisely what made it interesting. Criminal investigators often talk about the concept of designed normalcy. The idea is simple. If someone intends to move unnoticed through a residential area, the best strategy is not to behave suspiciously. It is to appear completely ordinary. The car seen on the camera appears to follow that principle. It moves at a controlled pace. It does not stop abruptly. It does not circle the block repeatedly. It simply enters the frame, travels through the street, and disappears from view. For most viewers, the clip would mean nothing. But for investigators, every vehicle passing through a neighborhood during a narrow investigative window becomes significant. Detectives begin by asking a series of questions. Was the car already known to residents on the street? Did it belong to someone who lives nearby? Did other cameras capture the same vehicle entering or leaving surrounding roads? And perhaps most importantly, did the timing match the window investigators were trying to explain? The car's appearance within minutes of the pacemaker monitor, going silent, places it inside a very specific moment in the timeline. That does not automatically mean it is connected to Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, but it means investigators cannot ignore it. Another factor quickly became clear when analysts began examining the type of vehicle captured on camera. It was not a flashy sports car or a distinctive luxury vehicle that would immediately attract attention. It appeared to be a compact, common model, the type of car that blends effortlessly into everyday traffic. Cars like these are everywhere. They fill parking lots, driveways, and city streets. They rarely draw a second glance from neighbors or passing drivers. In investigative terms, that kind of vehicle can be remarkably effective at moving unnoticed. If someone wanted to enter or leave a residential neighborhood without attracting attention, driving a common car would be one of the simplest ways to do it. The footage itself, however, only reveals part of the picture. Investigators rarely rely on a single camera. Modern neighborhoods are filled with doorbell cameras, driveway systems, and street-facing security devices. Each one captures a small fragment of the surrounding environment. When detectives analyze a vehicle sighting, they often attempt to reconstruct its entire route. Where did the car come from before it appeared on that camera? Which roads would it need to travel to reach the neighborhood? Did other cameras capture it entering or leaving the broader area? By connecting multiple pieces of footage together, investigators can sometimes track a vehicle across an entire section of a city. And when they do, patterns begin to emerge. Routes repeat. Turn decisions reveal familiarity with the area. Entry and exit points begin to form a map. In the case of the vehicle seen that night, the real significance may not lie in the short clip captured on a single camera. The significance may lie in what happens before and after that moment, the path the car took to arrive there, and the direction it traveled once it disappeared into the darkness beyond the camera's frame. Because in investigations like this, invisibility is rarely perfect. Even the most ordinary vehicle leaves a trail. In modern investigations, not all evidence comes from laboratories. Some of the most powerful clues are not fingerprints, DNA samples, or physical objects recovered from a crime scene. Instead, they come from patterns, small decisions people make as they move through space and time. Investigators call these patterns behavioral artifacts. Unlike traditional evidence, a behavioral artifact is not something someone intentionally leaves behind. It forms naturally through routine actions, the road someone chooses to drive, the time they leave a location, the way they enter or exit a neighborhood. Individually, these actions appear meaningless, but when examined together, they can reveal a story. In the case of Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, detectives began assembling a timeline built almost entirely from these behavioral traces. Cameras provided timestamps. Digital devices recorded signals. Vehicles appeared and disappeared across different blocks. Each fragment represented a small piece of movement. And when investigators started placing those pieces next to each other, they began to form a pattern. The concept is simple. If a person enters a neighborhood at a certain time, appears on one camera, then later appears on another camera leaving the area, investigators can begin mapping their route. That route becomes a behavioral artifact, a recorded pattern of choices. The pattern answers quiet questions. Did the driver know the area well enough to choose side streets instead of main roads? Did the vehicle hesitate at intersections, suggesting unfamiliarity? Did it take the most direct route out of the neighborhood, or a route that suggests prior knowledge of how to avoid traffic or attention? Each decision reveals something about the person behind the wheel. Over time, these small decisions accumulate. Investigators compare them with known routines and locations connected to people of interest. They examine where individuals live, where they work, and which routes they would naturally use when traveling through the area. If the routes captured on camera match the routes someone regularly travels, that overlap becomes significant. But behavioral artifacts do more than map movement. They also map timing. When detectives reconstruct a timeline, they examine how long each step would realistically take. How many minutes does it take to move from a specific house to a specific intersection? How quickly could someone exit the neighborhood using the most direct path? These calculations allow investigators to test whether certain scenarios are possible. If the timeline works, the pattern holds. If it does not, investigators continue searching. In Nancy Guthrie's case, the investigation appears to revolve around the narrow sequence of events that unfolded after the pacemaker monitor stopped transmitting. Detectives began layering digital timestamps with vehicle sightings and geographic routes. The result was not a single dramatic piece of evidence. It was a growing behavioral map. A vehicle passes through a camera frame. Minutes later, another camera captures a similar vehicle on a nearby road. Cell signals appear in the same corridor. Individually, none of these events proves anything. But together, they begin forming a portrait of movement during the exact window investigators are trying to explain. This is why behavioral artifacts can be so powerful in court. Unlike eyewitness testimony, they do not rely on memory. Unlike confessions, they do not rely on cooperation. They rely on math. Roots, timestamps, and distances create a sequence that either fits together or falls apart. And when the pieces do fit, they can quietly reconstruct events that no one ever intended to reveal. In almost every disappearance investigation, one question appears early and never truly goes away. Who was the last person to see the missing individual alive? Investigators begin with that point not because it proves guilt or innocence, but because it marks the final confirmed moment in the timeline. From that moment forward, every event becomes part of a narrowing window of uncertainty. In Nancy Guthrie's case, that final confirmed interaction leads directly to someone within her own family circle. Tomaso Cioni. According to the known timeline, Cioni was the last person publicly identified as having seen Nancy alive on the evening before her disappearance. The interaction itself, by most accounts, did not appear unusual. It was part of a normal evening routine, the type of everyday contact that rarely draws attention at the time. But when someone vanishes hours later, ordinary moments take on a new weight. Investigators begin reconstructing everything that happened after that final sighting. What time did the interaction end? Who else had contact with Nancy afterward? Did anyone enter or leave the home later that night? These questions form what detectives call the operative window, the period of time between the last confirmed sighting and the first sign that something may have gone wrong. In this case, that window stretches across several late-night hours before the pacemaker monitor stopped transmitting in the early morning. Within that span of time, investigators must determine whether Nancy Guthrie remained safe inside her home or whether something changed long before the electronic signal disappeared. Being the last known person to see someone alive does not automatically imply involvement in their disappearance, but it does place that individual at a critical point in the timeline. For investigators, this makes the person essential to understanding the sequence of events. They examine everything surrounding that final contact: phone activity, movement patterns, travel records, digital timestamps from nearby devices. Even subtle details such as lighting changes captured on neighborhood cameras can help establish whether anyone entered or exited the property during the hours that followed. Investigators also consider the natural rhythms of a household. Did Nancy normally stay awake late? Did she typically lock her doors at a certain time? Were there routines that might indicate whether someone visiting the home later would have been expected or unusual? Every detail helps narrow the window further. As the timeline becomes clearer, detectives begin aligning that window with other data, such as the vehicle captured on a nearby camera and the moment Nancy's medical monitor stopped transmitting. If those events fall within the same stretch of time, the investigative focus sharpens. Because that means the final known contact with Nancy Guthrie occurred only hours before something interrupted the normal functioning of her medical device, and a vehicle moved through the quiet neighborhood outside. For investigators, the significance of this timeline is not about assigning blame. It is about establishing the boundaries of the story. The last person to see Nancy alive stands at the edge of those boundaries, the final confirmed link between an ordinary evening and the unexplained silence that followed. When investigators search a property during a major case, the public often imagines a single dramatic moment: detectives arriving with warrants, collecting evidence, and leaving with boxes. But real investigations rarely work that way. In complex cases, investigators sometimes return to the same location more than once. Each visit is usually tied to a new development, a new lead, or a new piece of evidence that requires another look. In the investigation into Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, one detail that has drawn attention is the number of times authorities reportedly returned to search the same property connected to the case. 5 separate visits. For investigators, repeated searches are not routine. Each warrant must be supported by a specific investigative reason. Law enforcement cannot simply revisit a location out of curiosity. They must explain to a judge what new information justifies another search and what evidence they believe may still be present. This is why repeated searches often signal that an investigation is evolving. The first search typically focuses on immediate concerns, securing the area, documenting the scene, and collecting anything that appears obviously relevant. Detectives photograph rooms, gather objects, and examine areas where signs of disturbance may appear. But the results of that first search often raise new questions. Laboratory analysis may reveal traces that require a closer look at a specific room or object. Surveillance footage may reveal activity investigators did not initially know about. Digital evidence from phones or computers may suggest a location that deserves further examination. When that happens, investigators return. Each return is more targeted than the last. Instead of surveying an entire property, detectives may focus on a particular section of the house, a vehicle parked outside, or a specific item that earlier analysis flagged as important. In some cases, specialized forensic teams are brought in during later searches. These teams use advanced methods such as chemical detection tools, alternate light sources, and trace evidence recovery techniques designed to locate materials invisible to the naked eye. The goal is not to repeat the same search. The goal is to follow the evidence wherever it leads. In the case of Nancy Guthrie, the repeated visits to the same property suggest that investigators believed there were still unanswered questions connected to that location. Each search may have been prompted by new information emerging from other parts of the investigation: surveillance footage, digital records, or forensic testing. From the outside, it can appear mysterious. Why return again? What are investigators still looking for? But to experienced detectives, repeated searches often mean the investigation is moving forward rather than stalling. Every new piece of evidence creates another thread to follow. Sometimes those threads lead back to places investigators have already examined, but now with clearer direction. Because in an investigation built on timelines, movement patterns, and behavioral artifacts, even the smallest overlooked detail can suddenly become important. And when that happens, investigators do not hesitate to go back and look again. When investigators analyze surveillance footage, they are often forced to work with imperfect images. Security cameras are designed to monitor property, not to capture clear facial details or precise measurements. Many operate in low light from awkward angles or at distances that make identification difficult. Faces blur, shadows stretch across the ground, shapes become outlines rather than clear figures. Yet even within those limitations, investigators can sometimes extract useful physical clues. One of the most common techniques involves estimating a person's height. When a figure appears on camera near a doorway, porch railing, or wall with known dimensions, analysts can use those reference points to calculate approximate height ranges. These estimates are rarely exact, but they can narrow the possibilities. In the footage connected to the Nancy Guthrie investigation, analysts reportedly attempted to estimate the height of the individual captured near the property during the early morning hours. Based on those measurements, the figure appears to fall within a general range, roughly between 5 feet 9 inches and 5 feet 10 inches tall. At first glance, that might seem like a small detail. But when investigators begin comparing that estimate with people connected to the case, the measurement becomes more significant. Tomaso Cioni, the last publicly identified person to see Nancy Guthrie alive, is reported to be approximately 6 feet tall, or about 183 centimeters. That difference, a few inches, creates what investigators call a discrepancy. In investigative terms, discrepancies are not conclusions. They are simply points of comparison that require further examination. Height estimates derived from security footage can be affected by many variables. Camera angles can distort perspective. A person's posture can change their apparent height. Footwear may add or subtract inches. Even the slope of a driveway or porch surface can subtly affect the measurement. Because of these factors, investigators rarely treat height estimates as definitive proof of identity. Instead, they treat them as one piece of a much larger puzzle. If a suspect's known height differs significantly from the estimate captured on video, detectives must determine whether the difference can be explained by those environmental factors, or whether it suggests that someone else may be involved. In the Guthrie case, the height estimate does not necessarily eliminate anyone from consideration. Instead, it introduces a new question. If the individual captured on camera does not perfectly match the height of the person investigators initially examined, then who else might fit that physical profile? This is often how investigations expand. A detail that initially appears to narrow the focus can instead open the door to additional possibilities. Detectives begin reviewing the people connected to the primary subjects in the case: friends, associates, coworkers, anyone who might plausibly appear within the timeline investigators are reconstructing. They compare heights, movement patterns, and geographic proximity. Slowly, the circle widens. And sometimes, the answer to a discrepancy is not that the first person investigators examined was misidentified. Sometimes it means there may have been more than one person involved in the events investigators are trying to explain. In cases built on timelines and movement patterns, that possibility can change the entire direction of the investigation. In many investigations, relationships become just as important as timelines. People rarely exist in isolation. They move through networks of friends, coworkers, relatives, and longtime acquaintances. When detectives begin mapping a case, those relationships often form the framework around which the investigation develops. As investigators examine the timeline surrounding Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, one relationship in particular began attracting attention, a connection that stretched back nearly 2 decades. Tomaso Cion and Dominic Evans. According to accounts surrounding their history, the two men first became acquainted years earlier through an ordinary interaction that gradually developed into a long-term friendship. Over time, that connection remained consistent, linking the two through years of shared familiarity. On the surface, friendships like this are not unusual. But in investigations where timelines and movement patterns are being examined, long-standing relationships can become significant. They establish trust, communication, and familiarity, factors that investigators often consider when examining whether two individuals could have coordinated actions. Detectives began asking a series of practical questions. Did the two men maintain regular contact? Did they communicate frequently by phone or message? Were they known to spend time together in the same locations? Most importantly, could their movements have overlapped during the critical hours investigators were studying? These questions do not assume wrongdoing. They simply explore whether a connection between two individuals might help explain how certain events could unfold. Another factor investigators often examine is background history. Public records sometimes reveal past encounters with law enforcement, particularly in cases involving property crimes or burglary. These types of offenses, while not directly related to a disappearance investigation, can sometimes indicate experience with entering homes, navigating residential areas, or avoiding attention. In the case of Dominic Evans, investigators reportedly reviewed portions of his past record while examining potential connections to the timeline. Again, the purpose of this review is not to draw conclusions. Instead, it helps detectives understand whether someone connected to the case possesses knowledge or experience that could become relevant when analyzing movement patterns and behavior. But the most important aspect of the relationship between Cioni and Evans may not be history, it may be proximity. When investigators map the geography surrounding a case, they often chart where individuals live, where they work, and which roads they commonly travel. If two people connected to the investigation both operate within the same geographic corridor, their movements can begin to overlap in meaningful ways. That overlap becomes especially important when investigators are trying to explain a narrow window of time. If one person's height does not perfectly match the individual captured on surveillance footage, detectives may ask a simple follow-up question. Who else within that person's circle could fit the description? The existence of a nearly 20-year friendship between two men connected to the investigation does not answer that question. But it does make the question worth asking. Because when investigators reconstruct events that unfold in minutes, relationships often provide the missing link between separate pieces of evidence. And sometimes, the most important clue in a case is not a fingerprint or a video frame. Sometimes it is simply the fact that two people have known each other long enough to trust each other completely. Every investigation eventually turns into a map. At first, that map looks simple: a house, a few nearby streets, perhaps a camera positioned on a neighbor's porch. But as investigators begin layering information onto that map, it becomes far more complex. Roads stretch outward, intersections multiply, routes appear and disappear depending on the direction someone chooses to travel. In the case of Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, geography may hold some of the most important clues. Her home sits within a quiet residential pocket of Tucson, surrounded by streets that gradually connect to larger roads running through the Catalina foothills. During the day, these routes carry regular neighborhood traffic, but in the early hours of the morning, they become nearly empty corridors. For investigators, that quietness matters. Fewer vehicles on the road mean fewer potential explanations for a car appearing on a residential camera during the narrow window investigators are studying. When detectives analyze movement patterns, they begin asking a series of geographic questions. If someone left the neighborhood during that time, which roads would they likely take? Which exits provide the fastest route away from the area? And which routes would only be chosen by someone familiar with the local layout? Several main corridors connect the residential area to the wider city. One route leads toward East River Road, a major roadway running along the southern edge of the foothills. Another corridor feeds into Oracle Road, one of the primary north-south arteries cutting through the region. From those roads, a driver can quickly reach other highways or disappear into the broader grid of Tucson streets. But geography does not only offer escape routes. It also reveals familiarity. Someone unfamiliar with the area might rely on a main road, following the most obvious path out of the neighborhood. But someone who knows the area well might choose quieter back streets, shortcuts, or secondary roads that avoid traffic lights and major intersections. Investigators study those decisions closely. Each turn captured on a camera provides a clue about how comfortable the driver may have been navigating the neighborhood. A confident route often suggests prior knowledge of the area, knowledge gained from living nearby, working nearby, or frequently traveling through the corridor. This is where the investigation begins overlapping with the known locations connected to people within the case. Detectives compare residential addresses, workplaces, and regular travel routes. They examine whether individuals connected to the investigation would naturally pass through the same geographic corridor where the vehicle was seen. If those paths intersect, the map becomes more interesting. Because geography can quietly connect people to events without a single spoken word. A house sits within driving distance of a neighborhood. A workplace lies along the same road captured on camera. A familiar route passes directly through the area investigators are examining. None of these connections prove anything on their own. But when detectives place them together on the same map, patterns begin to appear. Distances shrink. Routes overlap. Timelines begin to align with the physical layout of the city. And in investigations like this, geography often reveals something important. Not just where someone could have gone, but who might have known exactly how to get there without ever being noticed. For decades, some crimes remained unsolved simply because investigators lacked one critical piece of evidence: a name. Detectives might recover DNA from a scene. They might identify fingerprints or biological traces left behind during a crime. But without a matching profile in a criminal database, those samples could sit in storage for years with no clear path forward. That changed with the rise of forensic genetic genealogy. Instead of searching only for exact matches in criminal databases, investigators can now compare DNA samples to large genealogy databases used by individuals researching their family histories. These databases contain millions of genetic profiles voluntarily uploaded by people trying to trace their ancestry. When a DNA sample from an investigation is compared against these databases, investigators may not immediately find the suspect, but they may find relatives, a distant cousin, a shared ancestor, a family branch. From there, genealogists begin constructing family trees, working forward through generations to identify individuals who could match the unknown DNA sample. The process can take months or even years, but once the family tree narrows to a small number of possible individuals, investigators can begin confirming identities through traditional forensic testing. This process has solved dozens of long-standing cases. And because of its effectiveness, investigators increasingly rely on it when other evidence leaves unanswered questions. In the investigation surrounding Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, the possibility of forensic genetic genealogy represents a powerful tool waiting quietly in the background. If investigators recover DNA evidence connected to the events of that night, from an object, a surface, or even inside a vehicle, that evidence could eventually become the key to identifying who was present. Unlike surveillance footage or witness accounts, DNA does not rely on memory or interpretation. It exists as a biological record. Once a genetic profile is created, investigators can compare it against databases again and again as those databases continue growing. Every new profile added by a genealogy user increases the chances that a distant relative of the unknown sample will eventually appear. This is why some investigators refer to the process as a genealogy trap. Someone may believe they have avoided identification because their DNA does not exist in any criminal database. But if even a distant relative uploads their own genetic information to a public genealogy service, that single act can begin the process of tracing the family line back toward them. Slowly, methodically, investigators build the family tree. Branches split, names emerge, and eventually, the distance between an anonymous DNA sample and a specific individual begins to collapse. In cases where other evidence already forms a timeline, surveillance footage, geographic patterns, behavioral artifacts, DNA can serve as the final link that ties everything together. the quiet fragments of evidence suddenly point toward a single identity. Until that moment arrives, the investigation remains a puzzle composed of movement, timing, and relationships. But with each new technological tool, the puzzle becomes easier to solve. And when the final piece falls into place, the silence that once surrounded the case often ends all at once.